At noon on May 19th, 1780, the sky over New England turned the color of an old bruise, and the chickens went home to roost, thinking night had come early. Before we go further, let me say this, a quick word before we go deeper. These stories don't end. There's a new unsolved one waiting here every night. If that's the kind of thing you'd leave on in the dark, subscribe, and I'll keep them coming. Now, back to that strange noon. Picture a farmer in Massachusetts, standing in his field, watching the light drain out of the world. He has candles lit inside his house. He can hear his wife calling the children in, because the dark is coming, and it is coming wrong. Birds go quiet. Cows walk back toward the barn on their own, confused, the way they do at dusk. But this is not dusk. This is the middle of the day. The man looks up. The sky is not black like a storm. It is a deep, heavy yellow-brown, thick as tea left too long in the pot. Some say it looked copper. Some say it looked like the inside of an old brass bell. There is no thunder. There is no wind picking up the way it does before rain. There is only this strange, sourceless dark, pressing down on the treetops like a lid on a pot. This is the day history calls the dark day of 1780, and it is only the beginning of our story tonight. For almost 250 years, people have tried to explain what happened that day. Some say it was smoke, drifting down from wildfires burning somewhere far to the north, in the forests of what we now call Canada. That is the leading theory, and it is a good one. Tree ring scientists have found burn scars from that spring deep in old growth stands, proof that something big was burning around that time. Smoke can turn a sky strange colors. Smoke can blot out the sun. But here is the part that still bothers the careful thinkers. Witnesses that day said the darkness lasted far longer than any smoke cloud should. Some said it lingered into the night, so thick that the moon itself turned the color of blood when it finally rose. Rainwater collected in barrels came out looking sooty, almost like ink, and some of it smelled of sulfur, not wood smoke. Few old accounts describe a strange stillness in the air, a kind of pressure, like the world was holding its breath. Was it only fire, far away, doing something fires are not supposed to do this well? Or was it something else entirely, something the settlers did not have the words for yet? That question, sitting quiet in old letters and diaries for 2 centuries, is the door we are walking through tonight. Because the dark day was not alone. It was not the first strange sky over American soil, and it would not be the last. Long before 1780, colonists from Roanoke to Salem to Jamestown looked up and saw things that made grown men fall to their knees in prayer. 2 suns in one sky, colors in the clouds nobody had a name for, fogs that smelled of metal, snow that fell yellow, like dust from a place no one could point to on any map. These were not the confused scribbles of frightened, superstitious people, though history likes to tell it that way. Many of these witnesses were doctors, ministers, merchants trained to keep careful ledgers and precise notes. They wrote down what they saw because they wanted someone, someday, to understand it. And still, all these years later, some of what they described refuses to fit neatly into any explanation science has offered. Tonight, we are going to walk through more than 100 years of American sky, from the first lost colony on Roanoke Island to the strange blue sun that hung over the eastern half of this country in 1950, a sun some old-timers swear they still remember, pale and cold like a coin behind frosted glass. We will sit with the settlers in the Carolina woods. We will stand beside Puritan diarists in the freezing dark of a Plymouth winter. We will listen to what the Quakers heard humming above their meeting house, and what the missionaries chose to bury, along with their notes, rather than let anyone read. Some of what we find will have a clean, simple answer, the kind that lets you breathe easy and close your eyes. Wildfire smoke. Volcanic ash drifting for thousands of miles on high winds, meteors, burning bright and quiet across a black country sky. But some of it will not close so neatly. Some of it will stay open, the way an old door left ajar lets the cold night air drift into a warm room. And that, more than anything, is the real mystery we are chasing tonight. Not just what the settlers saw above them. Picture the year 1587. Picture an island off the coast of what we now call North Carolina. Wrapped in salt marsh and live oak, the air thick with the smell of brine and pine sap. This is Roanoke. 115 people came here on wooden ships, crossing an ocean that took months to cross, hoping to build something new on ground they did not understand yet. They carried what little the age allowed: iron kettles, wool cloaks too heavy for the humid Carolina summer, canvas made of tallow that guttered and smoked in the wind coming off the Sound. They built a fort of timber, sharpened logs, driven into sandy soil, and inside that fort they built a small English village out of a wilderness that owed them nothing. Governor John White led them, and among them was his daughter and her newborn child, a baby girl named Virginia Dare, the first English child ever born on this soil. The sky above them was not the sky they had known at home. In England, the horizon sat low and grey, tamed by centuries of farmland and church spires. Here, the sky stretched wide and wild over marsh grass that moved like a green sea. Herons lifted off the water in the low light of morning. That night, with no city glow for thousands of miles in any direction, the stars came down close enough to touch, and the Milky Way ran overhead like a river of scattered flour. White left that August. He sailed back to England for supplies, promising to return within the year. He left behind his family, his neighbors, and a colony already thinning on food. War with Spain delayed him. Ships were seized for the fight against the Armada. 3 years passed before he could return. 3 years of empty ocean between him and the people he had promised to come back for. When White finally stepped onto that shore again, in 1590, he found no bodies, no signs of battle, no ash from a burned settlement. He found the fort standing quiet, swallowed halfway by vine and grass, and one word carved into a post: Croato An. No cross beside it, the symbol they had agreed would mean distress. Just the word, carved clean, and the empty houses and the wind moving through grass that had grown up between the floorboards. Here is where the sky enters the story, carried down not through official record, but through the accounts and rumors that followed the search parties home. Sailors and later settlers in the region spoke of strange lights over the marsh in those years, lights that moved low and slow above the water, the color of dying embers. Some accounts describe a haze that sat over the island for days before White's return, a haze that smelled faintly of something burnt, though no fire could be found to explain it. We cannot verify these accounts against a single surviving diary from the colony itself, because the colony left almost no written record behind. That absence is part of what makes this story breathe. Think about what that means. An entire village of English men, women and children disappeared, and the sky itself seems to have been trying to say something in the days around their vanishing, if the old accounts can be trusted at all. Some later writers connected the haze to smoke from native-controlled land-clearing fires, a common and practical practice up and down the coast, used to clear undergrowth and drive game. That explanation is simple, and it may well be correct. Fire clears land, smoke drifts. People far from home mistake ordinary smoke for something stranger. But others were never satisfied with that answer. They pointed to the color described in the old accounts, a red so deep it was compared to blood in the water, and a haze that clung to the marsh instead of rising and blowing away the way ordinary smoke does. They pointed to the timing, so close to a disappearance that has never been solved by any theory anyone has proven. No bones, no graves, no wreckage, just a word carved in wood, and a strange light in the sky that nobody wrote down properly until it had already passed into rumor. This is the world you need to hold in your mind as this story unfolds. Wooden ships, wool and tallow, a sky enormous and unfamiliar, stretched over people who had crossed an ocean and found themselves impossibly small beneath it. Roanoke gives us our first true taste of something that will return again and again in the story of early America. A sky that seemed to move with purpose, a land where the line between weather and omen had not yet been drawn, and a silence total and complete that the fog and the flame-colored light over the marsh have never quite managed to explain. Before the fog came, there were people, ordinary people with names we still know, because someone bothered to write them down before the writing stopped. John White was the governor of Roanoke, and he was also a painter. Picture him kneeling in the sand, with a thin brush, mixing pigment from crushed shells and plant dye, trying to capture the exact color of a heron's wing. He had spent years sketching the plants and animals of this new world, the flying fish, the strange soft-shelled turtles, the native villages with their bark houses shaped like loaves of bread. He was a careful man, a patient man. His daughter, Eleanor, had crossed the ocean pregnant, her belly round under her wool skirts. Seasick for weeks on a ship that smelled of tar and salt and unwashed bodies, she gave birth on that island in August of 1587, in a house of green timber, with the sound of unfamiliar birds outside the window. They named the baby Virginia. She was the first English child born on this soil, and her cry was the first cry of her kind to echo off those dunes. There was Ananias Dare, the baby's father, a bricklayer by trade, a man who worked with his hands and measured the world in straight lines and level stones. He had come to build something permanent, a wall, a chimney, a life. He did not know yet that permanence was not a promise this land had made to him. There was Manteo, a Croatan man who had already crossed the ocean once before, to England and back, and who understood both worlds better than almost anyone alive. He walked between the colonists and the tribes with the careful balance of a man crossing a narrow log bridge. He knew which plants healed and which ones killed. He knew the tides better than the sailors did. The English trusted him because they had to. They did not always deserve that trust. These were not soldiers. They were farmers, glassmakers, a surgeon, children, an old woman named Agnes who mended clothes by candlelight. They carried iron pots and hand querns for grinding corn. They carried Bibles with soft leather covers, gone dark from handling. They carried hope mostly, the kind of hope that gets thin and worn the longer a ship refuses to come. By the time John White sailed back to England for supplies in the fall of 1587, the colony smelled like a place trying to survive. Wood smoke curled from cook fires, fish dried on racks near the shore, filling the air with salt and rot. Someone was always hammering, always digging, always coughing in the cold nights that came early on that stretch of coast. White promised he would return within 3 months. War with Spain kept him away for 3 years. When he finally came back in 1590, he found the village empty. No bodies, No blood, no sign of struggle. Only the word Kurotoean carved into a post, and the letters CRO carved into a tree nearby, like someone had started a longer message and never finished it. And here is where the fog enters the story, the part passed down in ship logs and second-hand letters that historians still argue over today. Sailors on White's returning ship claimed that as they neared the coast, a heavy mist rolled in from the water, thick as wet wool, and it carried a strange smell, metallic, sharp, like a coin held too long in a closed fist. Some said it smelled like blood before it dries. Others called it the smell of a storm about to break. Though no storm ever came, the fog sat low over the settlement for 2 full days before the search party went ashore. According to the accounts that survive, it muffled sound, it swallowed the shoreline whole, so that men rowing toward land said they could not see their own bow until it scraped the sand, and when it finally lifted, the colony was already gone, as if the mist itself had carried the people away on its back. Nobody can prove that smell was real. Ship logs from that era are patchy, written by exhausted men with salt-cracked hands, and memory plays tricks on sailors far from home. Some historians think the metallic smell was nothing more than the tang of a nearby marsh, rich with iron in the mud, stirred up by the tide. Others point to old habits of storytelling, where every vanishing needed an omen to match it. But the people who lived through it did not leave us doubt. They left us a governor who painted birds, a bricklayer who built walls, a guide who walked 2 worlds, and a baby girl named for a land that would soon forget how to explain itself. Whatever came for them, it came wrapped in something the air itself seemed to remember. Go back with me now, before the trials, before the names Tituba and Sarah Good meant anything to anyone. Go back to Salem village in the winter of 1691, when it was just a small cluster of farms and a meeting house, and the worst thing anyone worried about was a hard frost killing the last of the turnips. This was a place of routine. Life moved with the sun, and the sun did not move fast in a New England winter. Picture the village at dusk. Smoke curls up from stone chimneys in thin grey ribbons. Snow sits heavy on the roof shingles, packed down and blue in the fading light. Men come in from the barns, with frost on their beards, stamping their boots at the door before they step inside. The smell of wood smoke mixes with boiled turnips and salted pork, and somewhere a baby cries, and somewhere else a mother hushes it low and soft. The Puritans who lived here believed in order. Every hour had its place. Mornings were for chores, milking the cows, splitting wood, hauling water up from the well before it froze solid again. Afternoons were for the fields, what little could be done with them under snow, and for mending tools, and for the endless small repairs a farm demands to simply keep standing. Evenings belonged to scripture. Father would read by candlelight, his voice low and steady, while his children sat close on a bench, listening more to the sound than the words. Nobody in Salem village owned much. A few pewter plates, a Bible, heavy and well worn, its pages soft as cloth from handling. Perhaps a clock, though most families told time by the light and by the church bell, which rang out over the frozen fields like a voice calling everyone back to the same shared clock. The winters were long, and the nights were longer, and people filled those nights with prayer, with mending, with the low murmur of family talk near the hearth. There was comfort in the sameness of it. A woman named Anne Putnam might spend her evening carding wool, her hands moving in the same rhythm her mother taught her, and her mother before that. A farmer named Thomas might sit by the fire sharpening an axe blade, testing the edge against his thumb, thinking of nothing more than the trees he'd fell come spring. Children slept 2 and 3 to a bed, under quilts stitched by hands long since worn thin with the work of it. The cold outside made the warmth inside feel earned, and above all of it sat the sky. In a village like this, the sky was not something you glanced at, it was something you read. Farmers watched the clouds the way a man today might watch a clock. A red sunset meant fair weather coming. A ring around the moon meant snow. The sky told you when to plant, when to harvest, when to bring the animals in close. It was practical. It was familiar. Nobody expected the sky to surprise them. But some of the villagers, in their diaries and their letters, wrote of lights, small ones at first, glow low on the northern horizon some nights, pale green like a candle burning behind thin cloth. Old women called it foolish fire and told their grandchildren not to stare too long. Ministers mentioned it only in passing, the way a man might mention a strange bird passing overhead. Nothing about it seemed urgent yet, and nothing about it seemed like a warning. This was still the ordinary world. The lights were a curiosity, nothing more, tucked into the corner of a cold night, like a story told half asleep by the fire. Mother might point it out to her daughter on the walk back from a neighbor's house, both of them wrapped in wool cloaks, their breath rising in white clouds. They'd watch the pale shimmer for a moment, then walk on, unbothered, because life had chores waiting, and morning came early, no matter what the sky did, overnight. Historians now believe these early glimmers were likely the aurora borealis, dipping unusually far south during a period of heightened solar activity. It is a reasonable answer, tidy and scientific, but some who study the diaries of Salem village point out something the astronomy alone cannot explain. The tone in the writing changes, slowly, in the months before the trials began. The lights appear more often, they linger longer, and the words used to describe them shift from curious to uneasy, as though something in the village itself was changing right alongside the sky. Nobody in that winter of 1690, one could have known what was coming. The lights above them were quiet, and so were the fields, and so were the nights. But something was gathering out past the tree line, past the frozen creek, past the edge of what anyone in Salem village could yet put into words. And the sky, patient as it always is, was the first to notice. Picture Plymouth in the winter of 1631. Snow lies thick over the roofs, soft as goose down, and the smoke from a dozen chimneys climbs straight up into a still, cold sky. The colonists have made it through their worst years now. The graves from that first terrible winter are older, grown over, and the settlement has the shape of something that might last. William Bradford, the governor, keeps his journal by candlelight most nights, writing down the weather, the harvests, the births, the deaths. He is careful, he is plain. He does not waste ink on things that do not matter. But there is one entry, tucked between accounts of frozen harbors and dwindling grain stores, that reads different from the rest. Bradford writes of a night when the sky filled with light that had no business being there. He does not call it fire. He does not call it storm. He struggles for the word and settles on something closer to a glow, moving, shifting, low over the trees to the north. He writes that some of the people feared it was a sign of God's anger. Others thought it might be the Dutch, burning something far off, though no one could say what would burn that bright or that long in the dead of winter. Think about what that means. Bradford is not a man given to wonder. He has buried half his colony. He has watched his own wife go into the water and never come out. He writes about crops and covenants and council meetings with the flat, careful hand of a man who trusts nothing he cannot measure. And yet here, in the coldest part of the year, he reaches for words he does not have, to describe a light he cannot place. The strange part is not just what he saw, it is what he left out. Bradford's journal, the one that survives, is not the only version. Other colonists kept letters and notes from that same season, and pieces of them still exist in fragments, copied by hand, passed between families. A few of those fragments mention the light too, but they describe it differently. One speaks of color, a deep red bleeding into green, folding over itself like cloth caught in wind. Another claims the light made no sound at first, then began to hum, low and steady, like a struck bell left ringing underwater. None of these accounts agree on how long it lasted. Some say minutes, some say most of the night. You have to picture the cold that night to understand how strange this really was. Plymouth sat close to the water, and winter fog off Cape Cod Bay could freeze to a man's beard in minutes. The wind cut through wool and hide alike. People stayed close to their fires, close to each other, and any reason to step outside had to be a good one. And yet, the record says people gathered outdoors that night, wrapped in blankets, faces turned up, watching something move across a black sky that had no moon. No comet had been foretold. No almanac from that year mentions anything approaching from the heavens. There is no sermon on record explaining the light as prophecy, though prophecy would have been the easiest answer for a Puritan mind steeped in scripture and signs. Instead, what survives is confusion, brief and honest, tucked into the corners of documents meant for other purposes entirely. Some historians today believe this was simply an aurora, pushed unusually far south by a strong solar storm, the same kind of event that would return to the skies over New England nearly a century later in far more dramatic form. It is not impossible. The sun runs in cycles, and in centuries before satellites and power grids, nobody was watching those cycles closely enough to record them properly. A strong burst of solar wind could explain color, could explain the shifting shape, even the strange stillness of that particular night. But the humming troubles that theory. Auroras are famously silent, at least to modern instruments. No electromagnetic pulse should have created sound a person standing in a snowy field could hear, and later describe as ringing. Some researchers suggest it was psychological, the mind inventing sound to match a spectacle too strange for silence. Others simply shrug and say the record is too thin, too scattered, too many decades removed from anyone alive to ask directly. What remains is a governor's careful hand, reaching for a word he never finds, and a scatter of family letters that do not agree with each other or with him. Something happened over Plymouth that winter. Something bright and something cold moved across a sky that should have held nothing but stars. Nobody wrote it down right, because nobody had the words ready, and that absence, more than any account, is the strangest evidence of all. By the time word spread past Plymouth, every settlement from Boston to the Chesapeake had its own version of the story. You would have heard it first at a trading post, maybe, or on the steps of a meeting house after Sunday service. Someone's cousin saw the sky bend. Someone's father watched a star crawl sideways like a bug on a wall. The tale changed a little with each telling, the way stories do when they pass hand to hand, like a coin worn smooth. Old sailors had the boldest claims. Men who had crossed the Atlantic more times than they could count swore they had seen strange lights before. Out past the edge of any coastline, where the water turns black and the compass needle gets nervous, they called it St. Elmo's fire, when it danced on the mast tips, a blue flame that did not burn and did not spread. But what people described over New England that winter was different. they said. Bigger, slower. It did not flicker like fire. It moved like something with a purpose. The farmers told it their own way. An old man in Salem, so the story goes, stood in his frozen field and watched the North Star drift a full hand's width from where it always sat. He had steered by that star his whole life, first at sea and then by memory, walking home from town on moonless nights. He said the sky felt like a room where someone had moved the furniture in the dark. Nothing was broken. Nothing was gone. It was simply wrong, in a way his body understood before his mind did. At the tavern, the talk turned practical fast, the way it always does among men with calloused hands and little patience for mystery. Some blamed the cold, hard frost can play tricks on tired eyes. One might say, passing the ale down the table. Ice in the air can bend the light, make a star look like it jumped a foot when it never moved at all. That explanation satisfied some men for exactly as long as it took to walk home under that same sky and see it happen again. Others were not so willing to let the cold take the blame. They remembered older stories, ones brought over from England and Holland and the Rhine Valley, tales of sky omens their grandparents whispered about, before a hard winter or a death in the family. A moving star was not weather to these people. It was a sign, plain and simple, the way a comet was a sign, the way a red moon was a sign. The sky did not make mistakes. It sent messages, and a wise person learned to read them before it was too late to act. The Wampanoag families living near these new settlements had their own understanding of the night sky, built over generations of watching it without a single break. Their stories spoke of a sky that moved with the seasons and the spirits both, one that answered to a memory older than any settler's almanac. When strange lights or wandering stars appeared, these were not accidents. They were part of a larger conversation the sky was always having with the earth below it, one the English colonists were only beginning to overhear. Children, of course, had the simplest theories, and maybe the ones that stuck with people longest. A boy in one Massachusetts household is said to have told his mother that the stars were only sliding across the sky like skaters on a frozen pond. His mother did not correct him. She wrote his words down instead, in a journal that survived long enough for someone, centuries later, to wonder if the child had understood something the adults could not quite bring themselves to say out loud. What nobody could agree on was the feeling the sky left behind. Some described a dread that sat in the chest like a stone, heavy and cold. Others felt something closer to wonder, a hush that fell over a whole household, the way silence falls after a hymn ends. Few felt nothing at all, and shrugged the whole matter off, as fireside talk meant to fill a long, dark winter with something other than hunger and worry. No two accounts lined up perfectly, and that mismatch is worth sitting with. Maybe different people saw different things on different nights, and time folded it all into one shared memory. Maybe one true event happened, and each mind simply reached for the language it already had. The stars did not leave an explanation behind. They only left a settlement full of people, standing outside in the cold, each one certain of what they had seen, and none of them quite able to prove it to the others. You have to picture what a Puritan diary really was. It was not a place for feelings. It was a ledger of the soul, kept the way a farmer keeps track of grain. Every entry had a purpose. Thought moved through weather, through sickness, through the price of corn. So when the sky did something strange, a Puritan did not just write it down. He tried to weigh it like a coin to see if it was true silver or some clipped and worthless thing. That is why these old diaries matter so much now. The men who kept them were careful. They dated their entries. They noted the hour the wind, the state of the moon. They were not trying to frighten anyone. They were trying to be exact in the way a man is exact when he believes God is watching him write. And in dozens of these diaries, across New England, across the Chesapeake, across the young Carolina backcountry, you find the same strange hesitation. A minister starts to describe the sky. Then he stops. He crosses out a line. He writes something safer in its place. Take the diary of a Massachusetts minister from the late 1600s, a man whose name history barely bothered to keep. He describes a night in autumn when the sky over his meeting house turned the color of a bruise, purple and yellow at once, low on the horizon. He starts to write that it looked alive, that it seemed to breathe. Then he crosses out the word breathe. Above it, in smaller letters, he writes moved, as if breathe was too close to admitting something he was not ready to admit. Historians who study these diaries call this the habit of correction. A settler sees something his faith has no room for. He writes the truth first, in the heat of the moment, the way anyone would. Then, later, in the calm of daylight, he goes back and softens it. He turns wonder into weather. He turns fear into a footnote. You can almost feel the hand pause over the page. Ink was not cheap. Paper was not cheap. A man did not scratch out a line for no reason. He scratched it out because the words underneath felt dangerous, felt like they might mean he had seen something outside the order of the world God had promised him. Some of these crossed out words survive anyway, faint under the newer ink, if you hold the page to strong light. Breathe, watching, waiting for something. Small words, but they carry weight. They suggest that what the settlers saw in the sky sometimes felt less like weather and more like presence, something with intent behind it, even if no one wanted to say so out loud. The easy explanation, the one most historians reach for first, is atmospheric science working exactly as it should. Ice crystals high in a cold sky can bend light into false suns and strange halos. Volcanic dust, drifting for years after a distant eruption, can turn a sunset the color of a wound. These are real, documented, repeatable events. A Puritan minister, untrained in optics, would have no name for a sundog or a stratospheric haze. He would only have the language of scripture and dread. But a good historian never lets one explanation close a door too fast. Some of these accounts describe movement that light alone should not create, color that shifts against the wind instead of with it, a glow that seems to follow the observer's gaze rather than sit fixed in the sky. Optics can bend light, but it cannot easily explain a light that seems to notice you noticing it. What makes these Puritan records so valuable is their restraint. These were not superstitious peasants inventing dragons in the clouds. These were educated men, trained in logic, trained to doubt their own eyes before they doubted God's order, when even they hesitated, when even they reached for a gentler word and still could not quite believe it. That hesitation tells you something. It tells you the sky did something that the tools of their faith and their science both struggled to hold. This is the deeper current running under every strange sky story in early America. Long before Salem, long before Plymouth's second dark winter, there were already men sitting at wooden desks by candlelight, crossing out the word that felt too true. They buried their own witness under safer language, and in doing so, they left us something better than a clean answer. They left us proof that the doubt itself was old, that the discomfort was old, that the sky over this land has been unsettling careful, honest people for longer than anyone likes to admit. In January of 1780, a Connecticut minister named Ezra Stiles sat at his desk with a cold pen and a colder question. He served as president of Yale College, a man who trusted numbers more than rumors. But that winter, something fell from the sky that made him doubt his own trust in numbers. It was rain, warm rain, in the dead of a New England January, when the ground should have been iron and the air should have cut like a blade. Stiles wrote it down in careful script, the way a man writes something he needs to remember, exactly right. He did not call it a miracle. He did not call it a sign. He called it strange. And then he went looking for someone who could explain it to him. He was not alone in looking. Farmers up and down the Connecticut River Valley noticed the same thing that same season. Snow that should have stayed frozen turned to slush overnight, and streams that should have been locked under ice ran open and steaming in the pale morning light. Some families said the rain smelled faintly of sulfur, like a struck match held too close to the nose. Others said it smelled of nothing at all, only felt wrong, the way a held breath feels wrong in your chest. Stiles wrote letters. He wrote to other ministers, to doctors, to anyone he trusted to have kept a weather journal that winter. He was doing what few men of his time bothered to do. He was trying to build a record, a pattern, something bigger than one man's frozen breath and one strange evening. He wanted proof. This was not just a local oddity, not just one valley's fever dream. What he found troubled him more than comfort ever could. The warm rain had not stayed in Connecticut. Reports came back from New York, from Massachusetts, from as far as the Hudson Valley, all describing the same thing within days of each other. Warmth moving through winter, like a held breath finally let go. No storm system of the era could explain a warm front stretching that wide, staying that long, arriving with no wind to herald it, and no clear front to blame. Some ministers of the time reached for scripture first, the way their fathers had during the dark day. They spoke of the seasons turning against their order, of nature slipping its harness for reasons only heaven understood. Stiles resisted that reach, at least on paper. He preferred the language of air currents, of vapors rising from the south, of something he could not name but refused to call divine on instinct alone. He wanted a cause with edges he could touch. He never fully found one. That's the part of his journals that modern readers linger over the longest. A man built to measure the world, with instruments and Latin and careful hands, ran into something his century simply did not have the tools to weigh. He noted the barometric pressure when he could. He noted wind direction, cloud color, the exact hour water turned from ice to liquid on his own windowsill. And still, at the end of every entry, there sat a small, honest gap where a conclusion should have been. Some historians today look at Stiles's warm rain and see an early instance of a fern wind, a warm air mass sliding down off higher ground and rushing into a valley, arriving fast and leaving just as quick. It happens today in the American West, warm gusts called Chinooks that can melt a foot of snow before lunch. It is possible something similar rode down out of the Appalachians that January, though no ridge nearby quite matches the pattern seen out west. Others point to volcanic activity overseas, ash and gas thinning the upper air just enough to trap warmth close to the ground for a handful of strange days. Both ideas explain a piece of it. Neither explains all of it, especially the smell some families swore they caught on the wind, sharp and mineral, gone again by morning. What stays with you reading Stiles now is not the rain itself. It is the shape of his search, a candle held up against a very large dark. He did not chase ghosts. He chased weather, plainly, stubbornly, the way a scientist should. And weather, that one winter, refused to hand him a simple answer. He closed his journal that spring, with the matter still open, a loose thread he never got to pull all the way through before other duties called him elsewhere. 2 centuries later, climate researchers digging through old diaries have found his account and paused over it the same way he once paused over his pen. The warm rain of 1780 sits quietly beside the dark day in the record, less famous, less frightening, but just as unresolved. It asks the same patient question that so much of that strange season asked the people who lived through it. Down along the Hudson River, where the water runs wide and slow, past the cliffs, there once stood a Dutch trading post called Fort Orange. The year was 1663. The traders there kept careful books, because that was the Dutch way. They wrote down every beaver pelt, every yard of cloth, every coin that passed hands. But one entry from that summer has nothing to do with trade at all. A clerk named Willem van der Berg kept a private journal alongside the company ledgers. Most nights he wrote about the weather and the mosquitoes and how much he missed the canals back home. Then, on a warm night in July, he wrote something different. He said a cloud came down low over the trading post, and it did not move like other clouds. It sat there, thick and grey, right above the roofs, and it hummed. He described the sound like a swarm of bees, but deeper, slower. It came from everywhere at once, he wrote, as if the air itself had a voice. The other traders heard it too. Some ran outside with muskets, thinking wolves had come close, or worse. But there was nothing to shoot at, just the cloud, sitting low and heavy, and that sound rolling out of it like a held breath. Van der Berg wrote that the cloud smelled strange, not like rain, not like smoke from a chimney. He compared it to the smell after a blacksmith strikes hot iron, sharp and metallic, catching in the back of the throat. He said the local Mohawk traders, who camped nearby that night, would not come close to the fort. They stayed by their fires on the far side of the field, watching, saying nothing. One old trader, a man named Cornelius, later told Van der Berg what the Mohawk elders believe. They said, the sky sometimes breathes low and slow, like a great animal resting. They said this was one of those nights. It was not a warning, Cornelius said they told him. It was simply something that happened, the way rivers flood, or the way geese fly south. The people who lived along that river for generations before the Dutch arrived had their own words for a sky that hummed and sat too close to the earth. They did not fear it the way the traders did. They simply waited for it to pass. And pass it did. Van der Berg wrote that near dawn, the cloud lifted straight up, all at once, like a curtain pulled by an unseen hand. The humming stopped the moment it rose. The morning came in clear and gold, birds calling, the river glinting under new light, as if nothing strange had happened at all. He walked the grounds looking for scorch marks, broken branches, anything to explain what he had heard. He found nothing. The grass was not even bent. He never wrote about it again in his journal. Some historians who found his pages centuries later wonder if he was embarrassed, or if his superiors told him to stop filling company records with fright and foolishness. But before he closed that chapter, he left one line that has stayed with people ever since. He wrote in his careful Dutch script that he did not believe God sent that cloud to punish them. He believed something older than God's punishment lived in that sky, something that had been there long before the Dutch built their fort, and would be there long after. Modern researchers who study early colonial weather records have their own guesses about that night. Some think it might have been an early, low-hanging fog bank mixed with insect swarms. the kind that can produce a strange collective drone on a still summer night. Others point to ball lightning, a real but poorly understood phenomenon that can hover, glow, and produce electrical humming sounds before dissipating without a trace. Both explanations fit some of the details. Neither explains all of them, especially the smell, or the way the cloud seemed to sit and wait, rather than drift with the wind. What stays with people who read Vanderberg's account is not the mystery of the cloud itself, but the quiet honesty of how he wrote about it. He was not a preacher looking for sin. He was not a soldier looking for an enemy. He was a bookkeeper, a careful man, writing plainly about something that broke his understanding of the world, and admitting he had no tidy answer. The trading post is long gone now, buried under the streets of a modern city. The river still runs past where it once stood, wide and quiet, catching the light the same way it did that July morning centuries ago. Nobody living can say for certain what hung over that fort and hummed through the dark. But somewhere in an old archive, Vanderberg's pages still hold the shape of that night, waiting for someone else to wonder the same thing he did. In the fall of 1741, a group of Quakers sat in silence inside a plain wooden meeting house near the Delaware River. Quaker worship works this way. No preacher stands at the front. No hymn breaks the quiet. People sit together and wait, and they speak only when the Spirit moves them to speak. On this particular morning, the Spirit did not move anyone. The sky did the talking instead. Witnesses later wrote that a sound came from above the roof, low and steady, like a swarm of bees caught inside a barrel. It rolled from one end of the building to the other. Then it stopped. Then it started again, closer this time, pressing down on the wooden shingles like a hand pressing on a drum. Several members opened their eyes. Nobody moved. In a room built for stillness, the stillness itself seemed to be listening. One elder, a man named Josiah Fenwick, wrote about it in a letter to a cousin in England. He said, "The hum did not sound like wind, and did not sound like thunder." He said it sounded almost like voices, though no voices could be made out, the way a crowd sounds from far away before you can catch a single word. He wrote that the meeting ended early that day. Nobody could hold their silence, with that sound pressing on the roof above them. Here is where the story stops being one story and starts being a pattern, because that same year, in a Dutch settlement 200 miles north, traders described almost the exact same sound rolling over their warehouses. They called it a humming cloud, low and grey, moving slower than any storm should move. And 40 years earlier, in Salem, farmers had written about a strange hum in the sky the winter before the trials began, a sound they could not place to any bird or beast or weather they knew. These people never met. They never read each other's letters. The Quakers by the Delaware had no way of knowing what the Salem farmers wrote decades before them. Yet the details line up like stitches in the same piece of cloth. A low hum, a slow-moving cloud, a sound that presses down instead of passing by. Historians who study these old letters call this kind of overlap remarkable, and they mean it as a puzzle, not an answer. One theory tries to explain it with something called infrasound, sound so low the human ear cannot properly hear it, only feel it as pressure or unease. Certain weather systems can produce infrasound, so can distant storms or shifting air masses colliding high above the ground. A colonist standing under one of these systems might feel a hum in his chest before he ever hears a true sound, and his mind, searching for a word, reaches for the nearest thing it knows. A swarm of bees, a crowd of voices, a drum. But the theory has trouble holding every piece. Infrasound does not usually behave the way these accounts describe it, moving in waves rolling from one place to the next, like something following a path. And it does not explain why so many different communities, separated by rivers and forests and decades, reached for the same specific words to describe it. Skeptics call this coincidence, the natural result of a small, tightly connected world where letters traveled slowly but stories traveled anyway, passed mouth to mouth along trade routes and river docks. Believers in something stranger point to a different detail. In nearly every account, the hum arrives just before or just after a change in the sky. The Quakers reported their sound the same week townsfolk noted a strange brownish haze sitting low over the tree line. The Dutch traders wrote of their humming cloud arriving the same month. A red ring appeared around the sun for 3 straight days. Salem's farmers linked their strange hum to a season of odd, colorless dawns. The sound and the sky seemed to travel together, as if one were the shadow of the other. Nobody living then had the instruments to test that idea. Nobody living now can go back and measure it either. What survives is only ink on old paper, careful handwriting slanted with the effort of describing something the writer had no good words for. Josiah Fenwick ended his letter with a line his cousin kept for years afterward. He wrote that the sky that day did not feel angry and did not feel like a warning. It felt, he said, like something enormous was simply passing by overhead, taking its time, in no hurry to be seen or understood. That sentence sat quietly in a family Bible for 200 years before anyone thought to ask what he meant by it. Picture Jamestown before dawn, back when the fort was still raw wood and hungry bellies. The James River moves slow and black past the palisade, thick with silt, quiet as held breath. Smoke curls up from a few banked fires. Somewhere a rooster has not yet found his voice. The sky above the tree line sits grey and soft, waiting for the sun the way it does every morning, in that place, in that year, in every year before or since. Then something breaks the pattern. The story comes down through colonist letters and later retellings, pieced together from fragments that do not always agree. A settler steps out to check the fort's gate, and he stops cold. Low on the horizon, where the sun always climbs, there are 2 of them, 2 pale discs, side by side, rising together like a pair of eyes opening over the trees. One burns a little brighter, the other sits duller, softer at the edges, like a reflection caught in water that has not gone still. He calls for the others. Men come stumbling out half-dressed, boots unlaced, muskets forgotten by the door. They stand in the mud of the yard and watch. 2 suns climb the same sky, throwing 2 shadows from every fence post and every man. The light falls strange and doubled, edges overlapping, colors bleeding faintly gold and rose across the low clouds. Someone in the crowd whispers that the sky itself has torn open. Nobody argues with him. This is the tale as it has traveled, mouth to mouth, again for 4 centuries, and, like most old stories, the closer you look, the more it shifts under your hand. The written record from Jamestown's earliest years is thin and scattered, much of it lost to fire, flood, and the simple carelessness of centuries. What survives are second-hand accounts, retellings written decades later by descendants who heard it from parents, who heard it from someone else entirely. The core of the story stays remarkably steady across every version. The 2 suns rise together. The colony falls into a hush. Nobody can say how long the second sun lingers before it fades, though most versions agree it was gone by the time true morning settled in. Now, if you want an explanation that fits neatly in a modern mind, Science actually has one ready. It's called a sundog, or in the old Latin, a parhelion. Ice crystals, hexagonal and flat, drift high in cold, thin air, and act like tiny mirrors tilted just so. Sunlight bends through them, and the eye catches a second bright point hanging beside the true sun, sometimes with a faint halo stitched between them like a thread of light. Some dogs are real, documented, photographed 1,000 times over in cold climates all over the world. A cold, humid morning near the Chesapeake, thin clouds seeding with ice at just the right altitude, could produce exactly the vision those settlers described. But here is where the story resists, a clean folding away. Several versions of the Jamestown account describe the second sun as moving independently, drifting slightly apart from the first, before it faded, rather than holding fixed beside it, the way a sundog should. A true sundog stays locked to its angle from the sun, bound by the geometry of the ice crystals making it. It does not wander. If the old accounts are remembered right, and that is a real if, something in that sky behaved in a way the simple explanation cannot fully hold. Skeptics point out, fairly, that memory bends stories over time. A tale told and retold for 400 years picks up embellishment, the way a river picks up silt. A fixed sundog, described once, could easily grow a little drift and wander in the retelling, especially once it's being passed down through families eager for a stranger tale to tell their children. That is entirely possible. It may be the whole and complete answer, and yet the believers, the old families of Tidewater, Virginia, who still tell this story at Thanksgiving tables, will tell you their ancestors were not fools. Colonial settlers knew the sky. They read it for storms, for frost, for the turning of seasons, because their survival depended on it. A sundog would not have startled seasoned eyes into stunned silence. Something about that Jamestown morning felt different to the people who lived through it, different enough that they carried the memory forward instead of letting it settle into the ordinary weather of an ordinary day. Whether it was ice in the high air or something the settlers had no name for, the two suns rose together over that muddy river fort, and for a few strange minutes the whole colony stood still and watched the sky do something it was not supposed to do. There is a detail in the old Jamestown accounts that nobody has ever explained. It sits quiet in the margins of a few settler journals, easy to miss if you read too fast. But once you see it, you cannot look away from it. The elders who watched that strange double sunrise did not just see two suns, they saw colors in the clouds around them that they had no words for. Think about that for a moment. These were people who knew the sky better than we ever will. They watched it every single day of their lives because their crops depended on it, their travel depended on it, their whole way of living depended on reading the heavens right. A farmer in 1607 could tell you the difference between a storm cloud and a fair weather cloud from half a mile off. He knew the grey of coming rain. He knew the pink of a clean sunset. He had a name for every shade the sky could throw at him. And yet, when the two suns rose over Jamestown, the men who wrote about it reached for words and came up empty. One account, copied down decades later from an older source, now lost, describes the clouds around the second sun as colored beyond hue, not red, not orange, not any shade a man could point to and name. The writer struggled so hard to describe it that he gave up trying and just wrote that it was a color with no name in his language. Picture that scene with me, the Virginia sky, stretching wide and low over the marsh grass, smoke curling up from the settlement's morning fires, thin and grey against all that strangeness above. and somewhere above the tree line, a light bending and pooling into shades nobody in that little wooden fort had ever seen before. Not the elders, not the ship captains who had sailed halfway around the world. Not a single soul standing in that mud and fog had a word ready for what hung over their heads. Some who study old atmospheric events say this makes a strange kind of sense. Light, bending through ice crystals high in the atmosphere, can split into colors our eyes rarely catch. A sundog, a rare kind of ice halo, can throw off shades that shift and blur in ways ordinary sunsets never do. If the air that morning carried fine ice, or ash, or dust from somewhere far off, the light passing through it could have twisted into colors sitting right at the edge of what a human eye can even process. Not the 7 colors of a clean rainbow. Something in between them, something that falls in the cracks of language itself. Others push back on this explanation, and they have a fair point. Sundogs and ice halos were not unknown to these people. Sailors saw them constantly on long ocean crossings. Farmers saw them over frozen fields in deep winter. If this had simply been a halo, even a rare and beautiful one, someone should have recognized it and said so. Instead, the writer chose to say the color had no name at all. That is a very specific kind of confession. It suggests something beyond a halo, something the eye took in but the mind could not sort and file the normal way. There is another idea, quieter and harder to prove, that some old-timers in Virginia still whisper about. They say the settlers were seeing a light that did not follow the normal rules of color, because it was not entirely of this world, not a trick of ice or dust, but something older, something that had always moved through these skies long before English ships ever crossed the water. The Powhatan people who lived on that land for generations before Jamestown had their own stories of lights that bent and shifted color over the rivers, tied to old songs about spirits who traveled the sky roads at dawn. Whether the settlers ever heard those stories, and whether the two are the same event seen through 2 different sets of eyes, nobody can say for certain. What stays with you more than any theory is that simple detail. Grown men, hardened by an ocean crossing and a hard new life in a hard new land, stood beneath that sky and could not name what they saw, not because they lacked the words for red or gold or violet, because the color itself did not belong to any of those families. It hung there anyway, real and undeniable, painted across clouds that had no business holding it, and then, as quickly as it came, it faded back into an ordinary Virginia sky, leaving nothing behind but a sentence in a journal that still puzzles anyone who reads it close enough to notice. Let's talk about the doubters for a while. Every strange sky has them, and in this case, the doubters have a point worth hearing. A minister in Hartford wrote about a storm that came through in the fall of 1789. The wind rose up fast. The sky went the color of a plum, dark and swollen. People ran for their cellars, sure a hurricane had found them so far inland. Then, just as fast as it came, it left. No trees fell, no roofs tore off, no branches littered the ground the next morning. The minister called it a wonder from God. A modern skeptic calls it something else entirely, a pressure drop, a dry squall line, nothing more. This is where the careful thinkers earn their keep. Meteorologists who study colonial weather records will tell you that fear does strange things to memory. A dark sky at 3 in the afternoon feels like the end of the world if you have never seen a low, fast-moving storm cell block out the sun. Dad, smoke from a distant fire, or dust kicked up from dry fields, and the light turns colors nobody in a farming village has words for. They reach for the words they do have. wrath, omen, warning. The sky did not change. The vocabulary did. There is real weight behind this argument. Colonial Americans lived without satellite images, without radar, without any way to see a storm system coming from 300 miles off. A cold front meeting warm, wet air can turn a sky green in minutes. Saharan dust drifts across the Atlantic even now, and it can paint a sunset the color of a bruise. None of that requires a miracle. It only requires weather, doing what weather does, watched by people who had never been told what weather could do. And the numbers matter too. Historians, who go back through parish records, find that most signs in the sky cluster around known volcanic events, known dust storms, known wildfire seasons out west. The yellow day of 1881 lines up with fires burning across Michigan and Canada. The blue sun, seen over the eastern seaboard in 1950, lines up with smoke drifting down from massive fires in Alberta. Line up the science, the skeptics say, and the miracle disappears. What is left is smoke, ash, and a sun shining through a haze thick enough to bend its color. But here is where even the skeptics slow down. That storm over Hartford in 1789 left no physical trace at all. No broken glass, no stripped fields, no flattened corn. A storm with wind strong enough to darken the sky and send grown men running for their cellars should leave some mark on the land. This one left none. Whatever moved through that valley made noise and made darkness, but it did not touch the earth the way storms are supposed to touch it. That is the detail nobody has ever explained away. The same problem shows up again and again if you read closely enough. Witnesses across 3 counties reported the same dark sky at the same hour, yet not one of them reported downed trees or damaged crops. A true storm system that size, moving that fast, should have left scars for miles. Instead, it left only frightened people and a strange calm the next morning, as if the sky had simply changed its mind and moved on. Some researchers point to a rare kind of atmospheric event called a dry thunderstorm, where all the visual violence of a storm happens with almost no rain and very little wind at ground level. It is a real phenomenon. It happens today in dry regions out west. But applying it to a wet river valley in Connecticut at that time of year stretches the evidence thin. It is a plausible answer. It is not a proven one. So the skeptics keep 2 things in their hands at once, and to their credit most of them admit it. The scientific explanation covers most of what people saw: smoke, dust, pressure systems, distant fires drifting east on high winds. That covers the color, the darkness, even the fear. What it does not cover, not fully, is the silence left behind. A storm that behaves like a storm in every way, except the one way that matters most, the way it touches the ground, is a storm that resists a tidy label. Even the most hardened doubter, standing in that Hartford church records room, reading the same page a second time, will admit something quietly. The sky did something that day. What that something actually was, the ledgers do not say, and no explanation offered since, however reasonable, has managed to make the silence make sense. Not everyone who saw the strange skies stayed quiet about it. For every farmer who shrugged and went back to his plow, there was a woman who wrote it down, a minister who preached about it, a child who never forgot the color and told her grandchildren who told theirs. These are the believers, and they did not need anyone's permission to trust their own eyes. In a small town outside Hartford, a woman named Prudence Wells kept a diary through the winter of 1780. Most nights she wrote about the weather, the price of wool, the health of her children, but on one page, dated in careful ink, she wrote about her light. She called it a glow the color of church candles, soft and cold, spreading low along the eastern horizon, long after the sun had gone down. She wrote that it lasted 3 hours. She wrote that her husband saw it too, and neither of them could explain it, and neither of them was afraid. That word matters. Not afraid. Prudence Wells did not treat the glow as an omen. She treated it the way you might treat a stranger who turns out kind. Something unfamiliar, yes, something worth writing down, but not something to run from. Her diary survived, passed hand to hand through her family for 200 years, until a historian in Connecticut found it in a cedar chest and realized what he was holding. That historian, decades later, tried to match her account to any known event. He found nothing tidy. No comet records from that exact week, no volcanic eruption on the books close enough in time. The glow she described does not fit neatly into the aurora, and it does not match the profile of a wildfire haze. It simply sits there in her diary, 3 hours long, the color of candlelight, unexplained and unbothered by the fact that it cannot be explained. Believers, like Prudence, rarely made a show of what they saw. They did not gather crowds. They wrote a line in a journal, said a quiet word to a neighbor, and moved on with the milking and the mending. But some paid a price for speaking at all. In one Massachusetts parish, a woman told her minister about lights she had watched dance over a hayfield, and he warned her, gently but firmly, to keep such talk to herself. Neighbors do not always forgive a person for seeing something they did not. Still, she kept telling it later in life, when the fear of being called strange had worn thin with age. She told the story to anyone who would listen. She said, the lights moved like slow lanterns carried by unseen hands. She said she felt no dread, only a kind of hush, as if the field itself were holding its breath. Her grandson wrote the story down 40 years after her death, because he said he could still hear her voice describing it, steady and sure, never once wavering. That steadiness runs through nearly every believer's account from this era. They rarely used the word miracle. They rarely used the word monster or curse. They used practical words, warm, bright, strange, gold. They described what stood in front of them the same way they'd describe a crop or a storm. Because to them, the sky doing something unexplainable was simply one more thing the world had decided to show them that year. There is a cost to that kind of honesty even now. Historians who take these accounts seriously sometimes get the same treatment the diarists got from their neighbors. A raised eyebrow, a gentle suggestion to focus on more solid evidence. But the ones who keep reading the old letters, the old sermons, the old family Bibles with notes scratched in the margins, they find the same pattern again and again. Ordinary people, calm and clear-eyed, describing lights and colors that don't match anything in the record books, and refusing to dress the story up or take it back. What did they gain by speaking, when speaking cost them comfort and standing? Perhaps only this: the glow did not vanish when they stopped watching it. It stayed, folded into a diary page, tucked into a sermon note, carried forward by a grandson's memory. 200 years on, we can still hold Prudence Wells's words in our hands and read exactly what she saw on that Connecticut night. She never asked to be believed. She only asked to be honest. And that honesty is, in its own quiet way, its own kind of evidence. Not proof, not in the way science demands it, but something older than proof. A woman's steady hand, writing down a color she had no name for, because she trusted what her own eyes had shown her, and figured that was enough. Go with me now to the back country of the Carolinas, where the land still keeps a strange kind of ledger. Settlers pushing west from Charleston in the 1750s found rolling hills thick with oak and pine, streams that ran clear over granite, and soil dark as coffee grounds. But in certain hollows, the old-timers said, something felt wrong. They called it the sky sickness, and they meant it the way you'd mean a fever. It came and went with the weather, and it left marks on the land that some folks say you can still find today. Start with the trees. Foresters who studied the old growth stands near the Catawba River noticed something odd about trees dated to the 1760s. A ring of stunted growth sits inside the trunk, thin as paper, surrounded by healthy wood on both sides. One bad year, then recovery, like the tree held its breath and let it out again. Settlers in that decade wrote about a summer sky that stayed the color of a bruise for 6 straight weeks. No storm, no rain, just that low copper light sitting on the hills like a lid. The old families passed down a name for that summer. They called it the long dimming, and they said the corn came in small and hard that year, the kind you'd feed to hogs and not to children. A farmer named Ezra Coltrane wrote in his account book, kept mostly for tallying seed and debts, one line that has outlived every ledger entry around it. He wrote, "The sun gives no more heat than a lamp behind glass." Nobody knows what he saw, but the tree rings agree with him. Then there's the ground itself. Along a stretch of the broad river, near where the Cherokee once kept a seasonal camp, settlers found a meadow that would not hold a fence post. They'd dig, they'd set the post, and within a season it would lean, then fall, like the earth underneath was shifting on its own schedule. Surveyors blamed loose soil and poor drainage, but the Cherokee who lived nearby had another name for that meadow, one that translates roughly to the place where the ground remembers the fire from the sky. They avoided planting there. They avoided camping there after dark. Animals seemed to agree with them. Deer hunters in the region noted, generation after generation, that game moved around that meadow rather than through it. Cattle turned out to graze would drift to the edges and stop, standing at the tree line like they'd hit an invisible fence. A rancher in the 1820s tried 3 separate times to pen livestock there overnight. Each time he found them huddled at the far corner by morning, breathing hard, refusing the open grass in the middle. He gave up and let the meadow go wild. Geologists have a name for what may have happened there. They call it a paleo lightning scar. Ground struck so many times over the centuries that the soil chemistry changed, leaving behind faint magnetic anomalies that animals can sense and machines can measure. It is a real phenomenon, documented in other parts of the world, and it would explain the fence posts leaning and the cattle refusing to settle. It would not explain why the strangeness seemed to arrive with the sky sickness tied to those weeks of dim copper light, rather than existing on its own the whole time through. Rivers hold their own memory too. Old maps of the Yadkin River show a channel that has shifted nearly half a mile west since colonial days, a common enough thing for a river to do, but settlers writing at the time blamed the shift on what they called the burning rains, storms that fell during the worst of the sky sickness years and seemed to scour the riverbank raw in a single season. Modern hydrologists say heavy rain after wildfire upstream could do exactly that kind of damage, and there's no reason to doubt them. The timing, though, keeps lining up with the strange sky years in a way that makes you wonder if it's only coincidence. None of this proves anything you could hang a fact on. Trees don't tell you why they grew thin. A meadow doesn't explain itself, and a river doesn't leave a note about what pushed it sideways. All the land offers is a pattern, faint as a watermark, that keeps surfacing in the same years the old diaries describe a sky gone strange overhead. Maybe it's only weather, layered on weather, drought and fire and flood, doing what weather always does. Or maybe the ground out there really did take something in those years, something that came down heavy and slow from a sky the color of a dying coal, and simply never let it go. The Carolina backcountry keeps its answer close, the way it keeps most things, folded into the wood and the soil where nobody thinks to look until the story sends them there. French Jesuits carried more than crosses into the wilderness. They carried notebooks, and in those notebooks they wrote down everything they saw, because Rome wanted proof of God's hand moving through the New World. What some of them saw made them stop writing mid-sentence. What some of them saw, they crossed out later in a different ink, as if they had come back years afterward to erase their own words. Father Louis Hennepin traveled the Mississippi Valley in the late 1600s, and his journals survive today in careful, looping script. Most entries describe rivers, tribes, weather, ordinary hardship, but scholars who have gone through the surviving copies note gaps, pages missing at the binding, entries that jump from one date to another with no explanation for the days between. Some blame water damage, some blame mice, but at least one gap falls right after an entry that begins to describe lights over the water, lights that moved against the wind, before the page simply ends. Spanish missions in the southwest kept similar records, and here the pattern repeats with a strange consistency. Franciscan friars stationed in New Mexico and Arizona wrote reports back to their superiors, detailing conversions, crops, conflicts with soldiers and natives alike. Buried inside these administrative reports, historians have found brief, almost apologetic mentions of the sky, doing things the friars had no framework to explain. A friar at Mission San Xavier wrote of a night when the stars seemed to bend like light passing through water, and then never mentioned it again in any surviving letter. You have to understand what these men risked by writing such things down at all. A missionary's job was to bring order, to bring the sure hand of heaven into a land the church considered chaotic and unclaimed. Strange lights and bending stars did not fit that story. If a friar reported miracles, Rome wanted them to look like the miracles in Scripture, angels and burning bushes, not floating lights with no name and no precedent. So many of them wrote around the edges of what they saw, using vague words, then moved on to safer subjects like harvests and baptisms. Some historians believe this explains why so many of these accounts feel clipped, unfinished, almost nervous. The missionaries were not liars. They were men caught between what their eyes told them and what their office allowed them to say. A few, it seems, chose a third path. They wrote the full account once, in private, then buried the pages, sometimes literally, in mission walls or beneath chapel floors, where a handful have since been found by archaeologists, restoring old adobe structures. One such cache, discovered decades ago beneath a mission near the Rio Grande, contained a single sheet, water-stained and brittle, describing 3 nights in a row when the sky over the mission glowed the color of a forge fire, with no fire anywhere near. The friar who wrote it does not speculate on cause. He simply notes the date, the duration, and the fact that the native converts refused to sleep indoors during those nights, choosing instead to lie in the open fields, watching. That detail echoes something you have already heard in this story, and will hear again before it ends. Across tribal nations, across colonial settlements, across mission outposts scattered from Florida to California, there is a recurring instinct to go outside when the sky turns strange, not to hide from it. The instinct suggests something closer to reverence than fear, an old habit of treating the unexplainable sky as a thing to witness rather than a thing to flee. Skeptics studying these buried mission records offer a grounded explanation. Volcanic activity in Mexico and Central America during these centuries released ash and gas that could travel far on high winds, tinting skies orange and red for days at a stretch. At campfire smoke, seasonal dust storms, and the isolation of frontier missions, and you have every ingredient needed for a dramatic sky with a mundane cause. It is a reasonable theory, and it likely explains a portion of what these men saw, but it does not explain why so many educated, literate missionaries, men trained to categorize and record the natural world with precision, chose silence and burial over simple documentation. Smoke and ash were nothing new to them. They had crossed oceans and knew weather. Something about these particular nights felt different enough to bury, not describe. Whatever moved through those southwestern skies moved through more than one mission, more than one decade, more than one denomination. The paper survived. The full truth of what it describes did not. Picture a farm outside Hartford, Connecticut. The year is 1780. A man named Ezra Stiles keeps careful notes, the way a scholar does. He is not a farmer by trade. He runs Yale College. But that morning he steps outside like everyone else, and he writes down something odd before he writes anything about the sky at all. The birds will not fly. Chickens huddle low against the barn wall. Feathers puffed, silent. Crows sit heavy on bare branches, not moving, not calling. A neighbor's rooster, known for crowing at any hour, stands frozen by the fence post, like a carved thing. Stiles writes this down first, before the darkness even comes, because it strikes him as stranger than the sky itself. This is the piece of the dark day story that often gets lost. Everyone remembers the black sky at noon, the candles lit at breakfast, the fear that the end had come. Fewer people talk about what happened to the animals hours before the darkness rolled in. Roosters across 3 counties stayed quiet past sunrise. Cattle refused to leave their barns. Fish, according to several accounts, stopped biting entirely, and fishermen from the coast came home with empty nets and strange faces. We know this because people wrote it down, not as legend, but as observation, in the plain language of farmers and preachers who had no reason to lie. A letter survives from a woman in Ipswich, Massachusetts, describing her hens returning to roost at 10 in the morning, as if dusk had come early. She was not a poet. She was not trying to frighten anyone. She simply noted what she saw, the way you'd note a broken fence or a sick cow, and tucked it into a letter to her sister about ordinary things. That letter still exists today, held in an archive, the ink faded to the color of weak tea. Naturalists later tried to explain the animal behavior, the same way they explained the sky. Barometric pressure, they said, must have dropped fast enough for animals to feel it before people did. Birds are known to sense storms coming, to go quiet before thunder that humans cannot yet hear. It is a reasonable theory, and it fits what we know about how sensitive wild creatures are to pressure and light, but it does not fully explain the timing. Some accounts place the animal's stillness a full day before the darkness, not hours. If pressure alone caused it, the gap seems too wide to explain away easily. There is also the matter of the ash. After the dark day passed, people in several towns found a fine grey dust settled on windowsills, on the surface of rain barrels, caught in the folds of laundry left out to dry. Some saved it. A jar of this ash, or something claimed to be this ash, sat for generations in a family in Vermont, passed down as a kind of relic, proof that something physical had fallen from that black sky, not just shadow and fear. Chemists who later examined similar samples from the period found carbon consistent with burned wood, which lines up neatly with the leading theory that massive wildfires in Canada choked the sky with smoke that day. That theory holds up well for the ash. It holds up less well for the animals. Smoke explains darkness. It does not easily explain why a rooster stops crowing a full day ahead of the smoke's arrival, or why fish stop biting in Long Island Sound before any cloud has crossed the horizon there. Some modern researchers point to shifts in atmospheric electricity, a kind of pressure animals may sense through their skin and inner ears, something science still does not fully map even now. Others simply say the record is messy, that dates in old letters get confused, that grief and memory reshape timelines without people meaning to lie. What remains, though, are the objects, the letters written in real time, not years later, the jar of ash in a farmhouse attic, a page in Ezra Stiles' own hand, noting the silence of the birds before he says one word about the darkness that followed. These are not campfire stories retold for effect. They are the plain, dated observations of people going about their morning chores, writing down what struck them as wrong before they had any language for what was coming. You can hold that kind of evidence. You can read the handwriting, see where the quill pressed harder on certain words. It does not prove ghosts or omens or anything beyond nature's reach, but it proves something happened that reached beyond the sky and touched every living thing standing under it that morning, feathered or otherwise. And nearly 250 years later, nobody has fully explained why the animals knew first. Some stories don't live in books. They live at kitchen tables, passed from a grandmother's mouth to a child's ear, told so many times the edges wear smooth like river stones. This is one of those stories. It comes from the hill country of Western Virginia, from families who trace their line back to the first wave of settlers who crossed the Blue Ridge in the 1740s, and at the center of it sits a wind that nobody could explain, a wind that carried voices where no voices should have been. The story goes like this. A settler family, working a hard patch of ground near the Shenandoah, heard something come through the trees on a still evening in late autumn. It wasn't the wind you'd expect. It didn't rustle the leaves the way wind should. It moved through the hollow like a held breath, slow and deliberate, and it carried sound with it, voices, low ones, murmuring the way a room full of people sounds from another room. Nobody could make out words. Nobody could say where the voices came from. The father of the house, so the story goes, stepped outside with a lantern and found the yard empty, the sky clear, the stars sitting cold and steady overhead, and still the voices came, riding the wind like passengers. This story didn't stay in one family. It spread the way these things do, carried by traveling preachers and peddlers and cousins who married into other hollows. By the time it reached the next generation, it had picked up new details, the way a river picks up silt. Some versions say the voices sang a hymn nobody recognized. Some say they spoke a language that sounded old, older than English, older than the tribes who'd lived there before the settlers came. One version, told in a Rockbridge County family for 5 generations, insists the wind smelled like snow, even though it was warm enough to work the fields in shirt sleeves. You have to understand something about stories like this. Each teller keeps what feels true to them and drops what feels excessive. A grandmother in 1850 might trim away a detail about ghosts because her church didn't hold with talk of spirits. A grandson in 1920 might add a detail about lights in the sky because he'd read about such things in a newspaper and it fit his memory of the tale. The story bends. It always bends. But something in the middle of it stays fixed, generation after generation, untouched by all that bending. And, in this case, what stays fixed is the wind itself, and the fact that it carried something that should not have traveled on wind at all. Folklorists who've studied these Appalachian sky stories notice a pattern. The wind voice legend appears in at least a dozen separate family lines across Virginia and the Carolinas, all from roughly the same era, all describing nearly the same thing. A still night, a moving wind that shouldn't move that way, voices without bodies. Some researchers believe this points to a real shared event, something that happened once across a wide stretch of frontier, and then scattered into 100 separate memories. Others believe it's something simpler. Frontier families, isolated and afraid, may have shaped the same universal fear, the fear of being watched by something unseen, into the same kind of story without ever needing a single shared event at all. There's a scientific voice in this conversation too, quieter than the folklore, but worth hearing. Some researchers point to a real atmospheric trick called anomalous sound propagation. Under certain conditions, cold air trapped near the ground can bend sound waves, carrying noise from miles away with unusual clarity while masking its true source. A distant camp, a river, a gathering in the next valley over. Its sound could theoretically ride an inversion layer and arrive at a lonely cabin sounding like it comes from nowhere at all. It's a tidy explanation, but it doesn't cover every detail these families remember, especially the ones who swear the voices spoke and nobody spoke back that night for miles. What matters most, though, isn't whether science can fully explain the wind. What matters is what these families did with the memory. They didn't run from it. They didn't board up their windows and refuse to speak of it again. They folded it into who they were. They told it at Thanksgiving. They told it to children scared of the dark, not to frighten them further, but somehow to comfort them, as if to say, the world holds mysteries, and your family has already met one and survived it fine. That's the quiet gift hidden inside these old family stories. They turn the unexplainable into something almost like an heirloom, passed hand to hand, mouth to ear, softened at the edges, but never fully explained. The wind still moves through those Virginia hollows some autumn evenings, still and strange, and somewhere a family still remembers to listen. In the spring of 1774, a man named Josiah Pruitt kept sheep on a ridge above the Yadkin River in North Carolina. He was not a preacher. He was not a soldier or a scholar. He was a shepherd, the kind of man history usually forgets, and if not for one entry in a granddaughter's Bible, we would never know his name at all. Josiah spent his nights outside, the way shepherds do. He knew the sky the way a farmer knows his fields, every ridge and furrow of it, every season it was supposed to keep. So when the clouds did something he had never seen, he noticed right away. He said the sky folded in on itself. That was his phrase, written down later by his granddaughter in careful, slanted script. The clouds did not blow apart the way storm clouds do. They pulled inward, he said, like a hand closing slow around something it did not want to drop. He watched it happen for the better part of an hour, alone on that ridge, with his flock pressed close around him. The sheep, he said, did not startle. They simply lay down, all of them at once, and turned their heads towards the folding sky like they were watching a fire. Josiah lay down too. He said later he did not feel afraid. He felt like a man standing outside a door while something important happened on the other side of it. By the time the folding stopped, the stars had come back out in a pattern he did not recognize. He knew the sky too well to be fooled by his own tired eyes. He walked home at dawn and told his wife, and she wrote it in the family Bible, because that is where people put the things they needed to remember and did not know where else to keep. Nobody in town believed him outright. Nobody called him a liar either. That is often how these stories survive, tucked into the space between belief and doubt, where a family simply decides to carry a thing forward without deciding what it means. His granddaughter added a line beneath his account decades later. She wrote that her grandfather was not a man given to fancy, and that whatever he saw it plain, and it changed the way he prayed for the rest of his life. That is the part of these stories that gets lost when we argue over causes. We spend so much time asking whether it was smoke from a fire out west, or dust from a volcano across the ocean, or some trick of ice crystals bending light in ways nobody had named yet. Those questions matter. They deserve real answers, and scientists still chase them today, pulling ash layers out of lake beds and rings out of old trees, trying to match a strange sky to a fire nobody remembers. But underneath every explanation sits a simpler fact. Something happened over that ridge. It happened to a real man with real sheep, and it left a mark on his family that outlasted every theory anyone would ever offer. That is true of nearly every account in this long, strange record of American skies. Strip away the aurora and the ash, strip away the yellow snow and the double suns, and what remains is a kind of inheritance. A grandmother who told her children to watch the horizon in autumn. A church that kept a hymn written the week the sky turned the color of a bruise. A family Bible with one line added in a hand that was clearly shaking. Historians can debate whether Josiah Pruitt saw a rare optical phenomenon, some rolling formation of clouds compressed by cold air pressing down from the mountains. Meteorologists today can point to documented cases of clouds appearing to fold or spiral under certain wind conditions. A real and measurable thing, no ghost required. And yet, none of that explains why he never told the story the same way twice, why each telling added a small detail his granddaughter swore he had never mentioned before. The sky he described might have a name in a modern textbook. The feeling he carried afterward does not. Maybe that is the quiet truth sitting underneath every atmospheric mystery in early America. The event itself may have a cause science can eventually name, but the weight it left behind, the way it moved through a family for 3 generations, the way it shaped a man's prayers and his granddaughter's memory, that part was never really about the sky at all. It was about a man standing alone in a dark field, watching something vast happen above him, and understanding, without needing proof, that the world was larger and stranger than he had been told. Whatever moved through those clouds that night over the Yadkin, it left something behind on the ground too. Picture a garden outside Philadelphia, late in the summer of 1787. The air is thick and warm, heavy with the smell of cut grass and river mud from the Delaware. Crickets soar back and forth in the dark hedges. Somewhere a horse shifts its weight, and the leather of its harness creaks like an old door. You are standing at the edge of that garden, where the light from the windows barely reaches. Inside, men in wool coats argue about the shape of a nation. Out here, it is quiet. Out here, the sky is doing something none of them can put into a law. Above you, the stars burn cold and sharp, but low on the horizon, there's a strange wash of color, a dull red, almost rust, bleeding up from the tree line like something spilled behind the hills. It has been there for 3 nights running. Nobody in the house has said much about it out loud, but you can feel that they've noticed. You can feel it in the way certain men glance out the window between arguments, and then look back down at their papers a little too quickly. Benjamin Franklin noticed skies like this before anyone else thought to write them down. Years earlier, in Europe, he had watched a strange dry fog hang over the whole continent for months, dimming the sun to a dull copper coin and cooling the air even in high summer. He guessed it came from a volcano, some fire vented from the earth on the far side of the world. He was closer to right than most men of his century, though he had no way to prove it, and no name yet for what a volcanic winter even was. Thomas Jefferson kept his own weather diary for decades, jotting down the color of sunsets and the strange rings that sometimes circled the moon. He wrote plainly, almost stubbornly, like a man trying to hold the sky still on paper before it could slip away from him. He did not reach for scripture to explain a green sunset or a hazy dawn. He reached for a pencil, a thermometer, and a patience most of his neighbors did not have. Stand here a moment longer and let the night settle around you. Feel the dampness gathering on the grass, cool against your ankles, even though the day was warm. Listen to the low murmur of voices drifting out an open window, mixed with the tap of a quill against an inkwell somewhere close by. Somewhere behind you, an owl calls once, then goes silent, as if it too is waiting to see what the sky will do next. These were not simple men. They built courts and congresses and arguments that would outlast their own bones. And yet, in their private letters, in the margins of their diaries, you find them staring up at the same strange lights that unsettled farmers and fishwives and frightened children in smaller towns. A blood-red aurora over Boston, a dimmed and coppery sun hanging over a Virginia field, a ring of pale light circling the moon on a clear autumn night, wide as a cartwheel, with no cloud in sight to explain it. Some of them wrote it off as smoke, drifting down from forest fires in the north, carried on a slow autumn wind. That theory held for some nights and failed for others, when no fire could be found and no smoke could be smelled on the breeze. Other explanations came later still, tied to eruptions half a world away, throwing ash and gas high into the air, where the wind could carry it for months. Nobody standing in that garden in 1787 had the tools to know for certain which nights belonged to which cause. What they did have was patience and something close to reverence. A grown man, powerful enough to help shape a country, would still walk outside after dark, just to look up. He would still stand in wet grass, coat unbuttoned, watching a strange red light bleed along the horizon, and feel small in front of it. That feeling did not end with the Puritans and their sermons. It followed the nation forward, dressed now in the language of instruments and observation instead of scripture, but carrying the same old weight. Stay in this garden a little longer if you can. Feel the cool grass, breathe in the mud and grass and distant wood smoke. Above you, the sky holds its rust-colored secret, indifferent to committees and constitutions alike. The men inside will go on arguing until dawn, but out here, under that strange light, there is only quiet, and the sense that something vast is passing overhead, unhurried and utterly unexplained. Pick up any old farmer's almanac from the early Republic, and you will find a strange kind of silence. The weather is there, the tides are there, the best days to plant corn and the best days to butcher a hog, all laid out in neat columns. But look for the blue sun of a certain October, or the humming cloud the Dutch traders swore they heard over the Hudson, and you will find nothing. The page just moves on, calm as a mill pond, like the sky had never done anything strange at all. That silence was not an accident, The men who printed almanacs in colonial and early American towns were businessmen first. They sold hope in a book. Farmers wanted to know when frost would come and when it would leave, not whether the heavens might crack open again like they did over Jamestown or Salem. A publisher who filled his pages with unexplained lights and blood-colored snow risked being called a fool, or worse, a man who scared his customers away from buying next year's edition. So, the Almanacs became a kind of quiet editor of the American sky. They kept the eclipses, because eclipses could be predicted and explained with numbers. They kept the comets, because comets fit into a picture educated readers already understood. But the things that could not be measured, the things that defied the tidy language of astronomy, those got pushed aside. A green sun over the Carolina frontier might get one dry line tucked between planting advice and a proverb about thrift. The full weight of what people saw and felt never made it to print. You have to go looking in other places to find the truth of it. Church record books hold pieces of it, written in the shaking hand of a minister who did not know what else to do but pray. Family Bibles hold pieces too, scrawled in margins next to births and deaths, as if a strange sky belonged in the same category as a wedding or a funeral. Letters between sisters, ship logs, the private diaries of farmers who never expected another soul to read their words. These are where the real sky survived, hidden from the tidy public record. Historians who study this call it selective memory, and they mean it as a warning, not an insult. Early America wanted to be seen as a rational place, a place of reason and progress, especially after the embarrassment of the Salem trials. Nobody wanted to be the next Massachusetts village, remembered for panic instead of piety. So the men who controlled the printed word made a choice, sometimes without even realizing they were choosing. They decided which parts of the sky belonged in history and which parts belonged in rumor. That choice had a cost, and the cost is still being paid today. Modern scientists trying to reconstruct old atmospheric events. The yellow snows, the strange auroras, the days the sun turned strange colors, often find gaps exactly where the almanacs went quiet. Tree rings and ice cores can tell you a volcano erupted somewhere on Earth in a certain year. They cannot tell you what color the sky turned over a Connecticut farmhouse 3 months later, or how long the strange light lasted, or whether children cried at the sight of it. That kind of detail only lives in the private hand, if it survives at all. Some researchers believe this gap explains why events like the Yellow Day of 1881 or the mysterious blue sun of 1950 still spark argument. The physical evidence, the ash and smoke and volcanic aerosols, only tells part of the story. The human reaction, the fear, the wonder, the sense that something ancient had returned to the sky, was often filtered out before it ever reached a printed page. What we call the historical record was never meant to be complete. It was meant to be comfortable, and yet the smaller private records tell a different story about the country itself. They show a people who lived closer to the sky than we do now, who watched it the way sailors watch the sea, reading meaning into every shift of color and light. They show fear sitting right next to faith, and faith sitting right next to wonder. The almanac gave people the practical sky, the sky useful for planting corn. The diary gave them the true sky, the one that made grown men fall to their knees in a field at noon. Somewhere between those two records, the printed and the private, the real story of early America's strange skies still waits. It is a story of caution, as much as mystery, of a young country deciding what kind of history it wanted to leave behind. The sky did what it did, whatever that was. It was the people below it who decided how much of the truth deserved to be written down. AWOG, woman named Eliza Bryan, lived near New Madrid, Missouri, in the winter of 1811. She was not a settler passing through. She had put down roots there, along the bend of the Mississippi, where the land was flat and the river ran wide and brown. What she saw that December, she carried with her for the rest of her life. And when she finally left that place, the story left with her, tucked into her like a stone in a coat pocket. The ground began to shake before the sun came up. That part is not in question. The New Madrid earthquakes were real, and they were massive, some of the strongest ever felt on this continent. But Eliza Bryan wrote down more than shaking ground. She wrote about the sky turning a strange dark color, thick with a vapor that smelled like sulfur. She wrote about flashes of light bursting up from the earth itself, not down from the clouds, lightning that seemed to climb instead of fall. Other witnesses along the river told the same kind of story. They described a roaring sound, low and constant, like a great mill turning somewhere underground. They described the river itself rising in waves, sloshing backward against its own current, and above all that noise and water, they described light, strange light, colored light, moving in ways that lightning does not normally move. Some called it a glow, some called it fire without flame. Nobody who saw it ever fully agreed on the color. Eliza Bryan did not stay in New Madrid forever. Like many who lived through that shaking winter, she eventually moved on, carrying the memory of that sky to new towns, new porches, new fires, where people gathered to hear a story. And every time she told it, the story changed just a little. That is what happens to a legend when it travels. It bends to fit the new place, the new listener, the new years piling up between the telling and the truth. Scientists who study the New Madrid earthquakes today have a name for what people like Eliza Bryan might have seen. They call it earthquake light. It is a real, documented phenomenon, though a rare one. Some researchers believe that when certain kinds of rock under enormous pressure suddenly shift and crack, they release a burst of energy that can ionize the air above the ground. That ionized air can glow, it can flash, it can look to a person standing in a dark field at 4 a.m, exactly like light rising up out of the earth instead of falling down from the sky. Not every scientist accepts this fully, and that matters. Some geologists argue the New Madrid accounts are colored too heavily by fear and darkness and the confusion of a violent night. They point out that terrified people in pitch-black conditions often misjudge direction, misjudge color, misjudge whether light came from above or below. A shaking house, a spooked animal, a river turning to froth. Add all that together, and the mind can build a sky show out of pure panic. But the accounts do not stand alone. Multiple witnesses across separate farms, separate settlements, separate stretches of the river describe the same rising light, the same sulfur smell, the same low roar beneath a sky gone the wrong color. That kind of agreement is harder to wave away. It does not prove earthquake light beyond doubt. It does mean something happened in that sky that ordinary lightning does not explain. Eliza Bryan's account eventually made its way into print, republished decades later by people who wanted a first-hand voice from that terrible winter. By then, she was an old woman, living far from the river bend where it all happened. But she told her story the same way each time it was written down. The ground shook, the sky turned dark, and strange light came up instead of down. She never softened it, and she never dressed it up. She just kept saying what she saw. That is how a legend survives exile. It does not need a grand telling or a practiced storyteller. It just needs one person willing to carry it, plainly and honestly, from one fire to the next, until Somebody writes it down for good. Eliza Bryan did that for New Madrid. She took a night of shaking ground and a sky full of climbing light, and she made sure it outlived her, mile after mile, town after town, long after the river had gone still again. Something changed in the American mind somewhere between the dark day and the wildfire smoke of 1881. You can feel it if you read the old pages close enough. The early settlers wrote down everything: a green sky, a red moon, a hum in the clouds over a Dutch trading post. They wrote it because they believed the sky was speaking, and a person does not ignore a voice like that. But their grandchildren wrote less, and their grandchildren wrote almost nothing at all. Think about what that means. The strange lights did not stop. The colored suns did not stop. The falling snow that came down yellow, the humming clouds, the storms that rose from the ground instead of the heavens. None of that ended when the 17th century did. What ended was the writing. What ended was the telling. Somewhere along the way, the settlements learned to look up, see something they could not name, and simply look back down again. Some folks say it was fear that did it. Not fear of the sky itself, but fear of what neighbors would think. A minister in 1690 could write about a strange light and call it a sign from God, and his congregation would nod along with him. A farmer in 1790 who wrote the same thing risked being called foolish. The world was changing around these people faster than the sky ever did. Reason was coming into fashion. Science was finding its feet. And a strange cloud that could not be explained started to feel like an embarrassment instead of a miracle. Others say it was simpler than that. They say the people did not stop seeing the sky. They just stopped needing it to mean something. The Puritans lived in a world where every falling star was a message and every red sunset was a warning. Their children lived in a world with almanacs and instruments and newspapers that explained the weather in plain, dry words. A blue sun became a weather curiosity instead of a message from beyond. The wonder did not disappear. It just got smaller and quieter and easier to forget. But not every strange sky went quiet without a fight. The yellow day of 1880, one still confuses the scientists who study it today. Some call it wildfire smoke, drifting down from Canada. Simple as that. Others look at the sheer size of the darkness, stretching from Maine down through New England in a single afternoon, and say the fires alone cannot account for it. The debate has never fully closed. Nobody has ever produced the one clean answer that satisfies every question. The meteor procession of 1833 tells a similar story. Thousands of people from Boston to the Carolinas stood in their yards and watched fire fall from a black sky, like snow falling upward in reverse. Ministers preached about it for years afterward. Scientists later tied it to the Leonid meteor shower, and that answer holds up fine for most of it. But the diaries from that night describe more than falling stars. They describe silence where there should have been sound, and colors in the fire that no modern account of a meteor shower quite explains. Even the blue sun that hung over the eastern half of the country in 1950 refuses to settle down into a tidy explanation. Most researchers point to smoke from massive fires burning in Western Canada, carried east on high winds and scattering sunlight into strange colors. That answer works for many, but there are gaps in the smoke records that trouble the ones who look closest. Nobody has ever fully closed the file on that one either. What all of this tells you is simple, and it is a little humbling. The American sky did not become calmer over the centuries. The people watching it became quieter. The strange colors, the falling fire, the fog that smelled of copper, and the clouds that folded in on themselves. None of it needed permission to keep happening. It happened whether anyone wrote it down or not. The only thing that changed was whether a person felt brave enough or foolish enough to say what they saw out loud. So the settlements did not solve the mystery of their skies. They just stopped asking about it in front of company. The wonder moved indoors into diaries kept private and stories told only to grandchildren by firelight. It waited there, patient as the sky itself, for someone new to come along and ask the old question again. Somewhere in an attic trunk, in a church basement, in a box of yellowed pages nobody has opened in 100 years, there may still be an account of a sky nobody has heard about yet. And it is waiting, the way the sky always waits, for someone to finally look up and take it seriously again. Look up tonight if you can. Find a patch of sky between the trees or the rooftops. It is the same sky the settlers looked up into, the same dome of stars that hung over Roanoke and Salem and Jamestown. It has not changed, only we have. That sky held colors nobody could name. It rained warm in the dead of winter. It filled with a fog that tasted like old pennies, and a fine yellow dust that fell like judgment on quiet farms. 2 suns rose once over a fort by a river. A blue sun hung over half a continent in the middle of the 20th century, and scientists still argue about why. None of it has ever been fully explained. All of it happened to real people, standing in real fields, looking up with real fear and real wonder in their chests. We have better tools now than the colonists ever had. We have satellites that watch the smoke drift off wildfires thousands of miles away. We have ice cores pulled from the bottom of the world, holding tiny frozen records of ash from volcanoes nobody wrote down. We have tree rings that remember cold summers the diaries forgot to mention. And still, when we run the numbers on some of these old sky events, they do not quite add up. The yellow day of 1881 should have been explained by Canadian fires alone. It almost is. Almost is a word that leaves a door open. That is the strange gift these stories give us. Not answers, an open door. A blue moon that might have been dust, or might have been something the atmosphere did that we have never seen since. A meteor storm in 1833 that terrified a nation and got tucked away in sermons about the end of the world. A humming cloud over a Dutch trading post that no one ever heard again. Each one sits just outside the reach of a clean, tidy explanation. And maybe that is exactly where it belongs. Think about the people who watched these skies without any of our instruments, no cameras, no weather balloons, no way to know that ash from a fire 1,000 miles away could turn a noon sky the color of a bruise. They had only their eyes, their fear, their faith, and each other. There, wrote what they saw in the plainest words they had, in journals by candlelight, in letters sent home across an ocean. Some of those pages still exist, brittle and brown,